It's pretty wild how a single comment, especially one about a train piston of all things, can just ignite a massive nationwide debate. And that's exactly what happened in Sri Lanka. So today, we're going to get into a really fascinating article by journalist Samarakoon that just unpacks this whole controversy, which really pits tradition against more modern ideas about child safety.
And this was the question that kicked the whole thing off. Now, coming from a prominent, high-ranking monk, this wasn't just some casual question. No, it was a direct challenge to the very idea of modern sex education. It really set the stage for this huge clash over what's the best way to raise and protect children in Sri Lanka today. And yeah, this wasn't some little off-the-cuff remark he made. This statement was delivered publicly at a conference where the monk basically argued that comprehensive sex education is fundamentally, well, unnecessary for the people of Sri Lanka. What's really interesting here is how he framed his whole argument. His position was built on a few key ideas. First, simple enough, that sex education just isn't needed. Second, he claimed that past generations, they were happy with huge families of 10 to 15 kids. And crucially, he said their success came from keeping sexuality a secret and upholding a very specific kind of modesty, something he called a superior form of ancient discipline. Okay, so to really drive this point home about traditional modesty, the monk used this very specific, very vivid story. And honestly, this is where the whole debate gets its name, this piston mentality. So he goes all the way back to colonial history, to the exact moment the first steam train arrived on the island. He took this incredibly powerful symbol of industrial progress and used it to make a pretty surprising point about cultural virtue. And here it is, the core of his argument. He claimed that when mothers saw the train's piston, which she actually called an organ, pumping back and forth, they immediately shielded their daughters' eyes. He presented this whole thing not as a reaction to some new, strange technology, but as this profound lesson in traditional modesty. That, he said, was their sex education. So, as you can probably guess, that interpretation did not go unchallenged. Sampath Samarakoon's article jumps right in and questions the entire foundation of this story, suggesting a completely different way to look at it. And this is where you can see the two worldviews right next to each other. On one hand, you have the monk's perspective. The piston moving is indecent, so covering a child's eyes is a virtuous, modest act. But the article just flips that idea on its head, arguing that projecting sexuality onto a simple piece of machinery isn't a sign of virtue at all, but actually a symptom of sexual repression. So the really crucial point here, according to the article, is what a lesson like that actually does to a kid. Instead of teaching virtue, this mindset teaches children to be afraid of the world, to see something sexual or dangerous in totally neutral things, and to basically stop looking at their surroundings with open, curious eyes. All right, so what about that other big argument? The idea that the past, where secrecy was key, was some kind of ideal for a happy society. Well, the article tackles that one next. The article argues that this romanticized version of the past is hiding a much, much darker reality. It suggests that secrecy wasn't a virtue, but was really just a veil that concealed incredible suffering. Women dying from unsafe childbirths, the unchecked spread of diseases, and a terrible culture of silence where abused children just couldn't speak out. So we're left with this really stark contrast. On one side, you have the monk's vision of this disciplined, happy past. And on the other, the article's picture of a reality where ignorance directly led to suffering and danger, especially for women and kids. Okay, now we get to what might be the most powerful part of the article's entire refutation. This is where it moves beyond just interpretation and gets into a direct fact check of the monk's central story. See, to add some credibility to his story about the train, the monk specifically pointed to the famous historical accounts of Robert Knox, an English sea captain who wrote about his time in 17th century Sri Lanka. So the article asks a very simple but totally devastating question. What does the timeline actually say? All right, let's just break down these dates. Robert Knox was in Sri Lanka from 1660 to 1679. He published his famous book in 1681. But the first official train journey in Sri Lanka? Well, that didn't happen until 1864. Yeah, that's a gap of 185 years. Robert Knox had left the island almost 2 centuries before the first train ever arrived. It means he simply could not have seen Sri Lankans reacting to a train. The monk's key piece of historical evidence is, well, just impossible. So after pretty much dismantling the original argument piece by piece, the article wraps up by building a case for a totally new definition of safety and modesty, one that isn't based on ignorance, but on empowerment through knowledge. So, what is true modesty from this perspective? Well, it's not about hiding or closing your eyes to the world. It's defined as having a scientific awareness of your own body, being empowered with the ability to identify and say no to unwanted advances, and understanding sexuality as a natural, biological reality, not some dirty secret. And this really gets to the modern reality that the article is highlighting. I mean, in a world where any kind of information, good or bad, is literally just a click away online, that old strategy of closing one's eyes is just not an option anymore. The only effective protection, it argues, is to awaken the intellect, to give kids the knowledge they need to navigate the world safely. And with that, the article brings its argument to a really sharp conclusion. The goal isn't to get rid of modesty, but to redefine it for an age where knowledge isn't the danger, it's the only real defense we have. It leaves us with a final thought, right? Does true safety come from teaching kids to look away from the piston or from giving them the knowledge to understand how the whole engine works?